I'm Kelly M., and this is The Common Surface. And we are blessed to have Dr. Joseph P. Farrell with us today again. And we are here to once again talk about the Giza Death Star trilogy, a fascinating series of 4 and now 5 books, one of which is cooling at the printers. And so we'll be looking forward to seeing that sometime in the summer. And so welcome, Joseph.
Thank you for having me back.
Yeah, so I've been digesting your new book, and I have to say that it's a mixture of digestion and indigestion.
Yeah.
Because it's really a profoundly disturbing, well, the hypothesis has always been disturbing, but now that more of the details are coming into focus and the implications are coming over the horizon, there's just it's just a very unsettling topic, but it's also tremendously fun because it flies in the face of 150 years of deception in physics about the way that nature actually works.
Yeah, and it's good that you stress that point because it is the idea that the Great Pyramid was a weapon, not just a machine, but a particular type of machine, and a very powerful weapon, in my opinion, a weapon of mass destruction at that. And then pile on top of that the speculations that I resort to in the book about the type of physics involved with it. Yeah, it's a pretty heady thing to digest, and there's no wonder that people have a little indigestion. You can imagine what my indigestion problems were having to write the thing.
Right, because psychologically you don't want to go there.
Yeah, you don't because we've been taught so many. The biggest Kelly, the biggest opposition that I have had with those books, and I had them as soon as the first book was published. I got this angry letter, actually a series of emails, but they went on for pages, from an individual who's dead now. I won't mention his name, but he was somewhat well known in the alternative research community, and in particular for his work on ancient Egypt. And he had this ancient Egyptian wisdom master. And again, I won't mention what his name is. So I get an email from this guy absolutely berating me for, publishing such a thing. And he goes on and on about his ancient wisdom teacher can read the hieroglyphics, and there's no mention about any of this stuff being a weapon, blah, blah, blah. How dare you? And what he epitomized for me was what I call the jonquils and daisies crowd. That group of people within the alternative research community that acknowledge the existence of an ancient, very high civilization. But in their thinking, with that high scientific and technological prowess came a very high moral society. And quite frankly, Kelly, that just flies in the face of most of the texts that talk about that civilization. I mean, my word, from India to Mesoamerica, those legends are full of the wars of the gods, and they are full of discussion of their extremely deadly, powerful weapons.
Right. Yeah, I mean, you choose your civilization, and they're all the same.
Right.
They're differing in the details. They're differing in the names, but they're not differing in the epistemology of it.
Right, and they're in many cases they're actually giving little descriptions of what some of these weapons actually did. And so, for me, it's a problem of all right, what would these texts, I'm putting myself in the position in that fourth book in particular. I'm putting myself in the position of Chris Dunn, because again, Chris Dunn, as far as I'm concerned, was the paradigm changer in pyramid research, because it's impossible to ignore his book, The Giza Power Plant, and continue on with the Egyptology narrative, that this massive giant structure with all of its embedded dimensional analogs to things that we take for granted in celestial mechanics or in material physics or what have you. It's impossible to have all those things in that structure to the degree of precision that they are in that structure and come to any other conclusion that they're there to increase the efficiency of a machine.
Yeah.
And, as far as I say, this was the paradigm changer in Dunn's work, because he goes to the pyramid with an engineer's eyes and with an engineer's toolbox, incidentally, and actually takes measures and demonstrates the clear, absolute precision of the machining in that structure. Putting a straight edge up along the edges of the coffer and then shining a flashlight behind it, and no light is getting through.
Wow.
Things of this nature. It's, in other words, what he did is he changed the paradigm completely. And I simply start from there and say, all right, what happens when you add people like Sitchin and the weapon hypothesis, Kelly, I want to stress again, it's not mine. It's Zecharia Sitchin's.
Right. Well, it's sort of like, with Chris Dunn, it's sort of like, you have a problem in your house with the plumbing and you hire an electrician.
Right, exactly.
And they've got the wrong tools.
Right, exactly.
They're there to cut and lay wire, and you need somebody who knows how the plumbing works.
Exactly. And this, this is the problem with Egyptology. They are simply looking at these structures from, I call it a narradigm rather than a paradigm, because they've got their narrative, which is constructed on an increasingly narrow basis of evidence, and argument, and so it's a narradigm. They've got their narradigm, and everything has to be interpreted through that narradigm. Unfortunately, it doesn't work.
Yeah, it's insane. The Egyptologists look increasingly like tour directors on the Love Boat.
Yeah, exactly. And I think there is an element, as we continue in these interviews, I'm sure that we'll eventually get around to it, but I want to mention it now because I think there's an element of deliberate misdirection in the field of Egyptology that has been there from its founding as an academic discipline. In other words, I think there is, for want of a better expression, there's an actual conspiracy to keep people looking at those structures in a particular way and not thinking in terms of ancient technology and weaponry.
Well, you see, there was a certain British captain that you mentioned in the book.
Yes.
Who retired as a captain and nonetheless was compensated as a major general.
Yeah, Colonel Vyse. He was not a captain. He was a
colonel, right?
Colonel William Howard Richard Vyse, Vyse.
Oh.
And Colonel Vyse was the man who supposedly, and put quotations around the next word, discovered in the King's Chamber there are so-called relieving chambers above the main chamber of the King's Chamber. All right. Now, anybody that can look at that structure with an engineer's eye can tell you, first of all, that the Egyptological notion that these are relieving chambers to relieve the weight on the main chamber is pure, unadulterated engineering and architectural nonsense.
Yeah. I have a relieving chamber down the hall, but
yes, exactly. It's not that kind of relieving chamber, but the stones that form the roof and floor of these so-called chambers are cantilevered in there.
Right.
So in other words, the whole structure is designed to push the weight around. Those stones on the roof or floor of those chambers have nothing to do with any load-bearing properties whatsoever.
Right.
As Chris Dunn indicated, and I think he's absolutely right,
Yeah.
the reason that they were so perfectly polished on the roof of the king's chamber, but the floor on the chamber above is so rough, is that they were chipping away the stone in order to tune the stones to particular frequencies. But anyway, getting back to Colonel Weiss, he blows his way, quite literally, dynamites his way into those upper 4 so-called relieving chambers, and voila, he finds magically painted in those chambers the only hieroglyphics ever discovered inside the structure at all. And voila, he happens to have discovered them on the walls that he did not dynamite into. and
Right.
And on top of this, he supposedly discovers the cartouche of the construction gangs, identifying the pharaoh Khufu as the fellow that's building this massive structure. And it's important for people to understand something here. When Weiss makes this discovery, the cartouche of the name of Khufu is very poorly executed. And this led Zechariah Sitchin, when he saw the actual diagram that one of Colonel Weiss's expedition compatriots drew, Sitchin immediately recognized that the hieroglyphic for Khufu's name was misspelled, and no Egyptian would make that mistake. And so Sitchin accused Weiss of a forgery. Well, long story short, and I go into the details in the new book, and I'll just cut right to the conclusion of the story. The cartouche of Khufu could be spelled in 3 different ways. But Colonel Weiss, at the time of his expedition, did not know that.
Right.
And in his private notes, which were only in the last few years discovered in a little county museum in Buckinghamshire in the United Kingdom, his private notes were discovered. And in the notes, what you see him doing is dithering over what particular hieroglyphic he's going to paint on the wall of one of the relieving chambers with the name of Khufu. In other words, he's deliberating over 3 different entirely correct spellings, but it's the deliberation itself that gives away the fact that he's the one that put the marks in those relieving chambers to begin with. Otherwise, he would not have expended the effort to, redraw the thing several times and make marks and record his internal debate and doubts about what to do. So, Egyptology, to cut to the chase, Egyptology relied on Colonel Weiss's discovery to say conclusively, well, here we have the construction gangs themselves, and they have clearly recorded Khufu as the builder of this structure. Well, no, sorry, they have done no such thing.
Interesting. What year was Colonel active?
Colonel Weiss was active in the late 1840s, early 50s. So Colonel Weiss is the first major European expedition after that of Napoleon, and after that of the Lepsius expedition from Prussia. The Lepsius expedition, interestingly enough, left the only graffiti on the Great Pyramid. That's another story. But Weiss's expedition did not benefit from the fact that later Egyptology did make the case that you can spell Khufu 3 different ways. So Weiss, he doesn't publish his doubts and deliberations. He packs those off and claims the discovery. I strongly suspect, Kelly, that Weiss's role has been that of a misdirection, a paradigm creator. I suspect that was part of his effort from the outset. Let's get everybody thinking that these massive structures are tombs.
Right. Now, so he was active in the 1840s-ish.
Right.
And that's around the time of Faraday.
Right.
And
right.
Faraday discovered or revealed some incredibly important operational properties of electrons in motion.
Yes.
In plasmas in particular.
Yes.
And then at the same time, we have this sort of intelligence agent,
right.
Damaging and then making up things about the pyramid.
Right.
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 And then 20 years later, we had Maxwell, James Clerk Maxwell, who was the Scottish physicist who we also had Hamilton's equations, which appeared also in the 1840s. So we have Faraday, we have Hamilton and Maxwell, right? All kind of in the same sort of generation.
Right.
And then we have, Maxwell publishes his equations, which the original paper was 12 equations with 20 unknowns, I believe.
22 unknowns.
22 unknowns, yeah.
Uh-huh.
All right. And so those of you on the line that are listening, what that means is the unknowns are different things that you can calculate.
Right.
So you can go in one direction and isolate that variable, or you can go in another direction.
Well, let's cut to the chase. You mentioned Hamilton, William Rowan Hamilton. All right. Hamilton is the inventor of a mathematical geometrical calculus called quaternions. Okay. And basically, a quaternion is simply a four spatial dimensional mathematics. What Hamilton can be credited as doing is taking imaginary numbers, which are used constantly in electrical circuits, and giving them the quality of a fourth spatial dimension. Okay. And then James Clerk Maxwell, when he begins to formulate his equations, he puts them in Hamiltonian geometry.
Right.
And it's very important for people to understand that in Hamiltonian geometry, a zero-summed vector field, in other words, where all the vectors are pushing against each other and they move nowhere. Okay.
Right.
They just sort of squat there. All right.
Yeah, like squeezing your fist and not moving your arm.
Right, like squeezing your fist and not moving your arm. All those vectors in the fist are just adding stress, but they're not moving your fist in any direction.
Right.
Okay, that's a zero-sum vector field. And it's very important to understand that Maxwell employed quaternion geometry precisely for the reason that it would allow him to mathematically model that field of stress.
Right.
What happens with Maxwell's equations is they get edited by Oliver Heaviside later in the 19th century. And what Heaviside does is he throws out that stress component in the quaternion geometry, and he recasts Maxwell's equations as four partial differential equations in linear algebra and calculus. That's the difference.
Yeah, so think of it this way. Think of taking the painting on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel and then telling Michelangelo he can only use four colors.
Yes, exactly. That's exactly what Heaviside did. Now, Heaviside later goes back and modifies his own equations. But my point with all of this is that if you are a graduate physics student today and you're in your electromagnetism class and they put up Maxwell's equations on the blackboard and you look at all of these partial differentials, what you're actually looking at are Heaviside's re-editing of Maxwell's equations.
Right.
And in the re-editing, what Heaviside did is he took out Maxwell's scalar stress component.
Yeah, it was Maxwell for Dummies.
It was Maxwell for Dummies, right?
Yeah,
Exactly.
yeah, and it just so people understand the quaternions a little bit. The left hand side of the equation represents the total energy of the system,
Right.
and the right hand side is what its position is and what its momentum, the total momentum of it is.
Right.
And so it's really good for predicting where things are going to go.
Right.
Right. And so just it wasn't until computer graphics really started to take off and people started to get into computer gaming that quaternions came back into fashion, and now they're used all the time
Right.
in these multiplayer games to predict where the bullets are going.
Right.
So they can take this quaternion geometry and do some of the fantastic graphics that you see in these games are a direct result of what Hamilton scribbled into a bridge in Dublin, back in the first half of the 19th century.
Yep. Yep.
Yeah.
And
So
that's literally the story, if I recall. He scribbled it on a bridge.
there was another famous physicist that also used quaternions to win a Nobel Prize. Do you remember who that was?
No, I'm not. My mind is
Paul
drawing to blank.
Paul Dirac.
Oh yes, yes, yes. Of course. Yes.
Yeah, Paul Dirac was sort of an autistic physicist from Cambridge. Yeah, he was very
autism in Cambridge. No need to comment any further there, folks.
Yeah, autistic free university, and and bless their hearts. And so Pam Dirac, Paul Andrew Michael Dirac, was also a specialist in doing sort of physical pictures of physical events. Mm-hmm. He would do these geometric pictures showing physical events happening in these geometrical pictures, which was kind of an echo which came out in Feynman when Feynman died. Yes. Of subatomic particles came out, right?
Right.
So Dirac used quaternion geometry to create a series. Think of it like a table, like a matrix. Mm-hmm. And the matrix is basically a picture of the fine structure, right? The medium itself, the fine material,
right,
itself. And there's particles skating across this from the upper left-hand corner to the right-hand corner. And as they go up out of the plane toward you, they're plus I, these complex numbers, these imaginary numbers.
Right.
And then it would sinusoidally go down below that plane, and it would be -1. And it's showing the motion of an electron as it dances on the top of the fine materium.
Right.
Right. And so that fine materium was defined by a guy named Wolfgang Pauli, mm-hmm. Who came up with these Pauli matrices, which showed them. And nobody ever explained in any of the physics courses I took that the Pauli matrices represented, the top of the Dirac sea.
Yeah, I think something that people need to understand here with your illustration is you mentioned these particles flitting in and out over and above or below the Dirac sea. It's important for people to understand that what you're talking about now, that sea is not a two-dimensional surface. It's a three-dimensional surface.
Right. So it's hyperdimensional.
It's a hyperdimensional thing that you're talking about. Right.
Right. And then so that takes us directly into a certain German scientist with a series of animatic comments named Ronald Richter.
Yep.
And so what was Richter doing, and why is it relevant 70 years afterwards?
Okay, if you read my book, The Nazi International, in fact, if you read my books from Reich of the Black Sun all the way up through The Philosopher's Stone, Nazi International, those books, and I include my book, The Cosmic War, in that. And there's a reason, Kelly, that I've been warning people all along that The Cosmic War is the one book that's the keystone in the arch of all the books that unites them all. And the reason why is because of the kind of physics I discuss in The Cosmic War, and it's the same kind of physics that I discuss throughout the Nazi books, and that is so much a part of Dr. Ronald Richter's thinking. Dr. Ronald Richter was the German scientist that went to Argentina after World War II and became involved in a project for Juan Perón's government in Argentina. And what Richter was trying to do very early on and very clearly was to create a controlled fusion reaction. And as a result of this, Richter was experimenting with plasmas. And in the course of his comments that he made after the U.S. Air Force sent a team to Argentina to interview Richter secretly. And I have all of these documents in my book, The Nazi International. You can read what.
And one of those guys was Alvarez, the guy who discovered the Chicxulub crater in Mexico.
I believe one of them was
Louis Alvarez. Yeah.
Yeah, Alvarez. Well, there's another fellow that's got kind of a murky background when you study him in relation to these post-war Nazi scientists. But Richter, in the process of his interview with the team from the U.S. Air Force, and this interview took place in 1952. So this is before the American Air. No, pardon me, 1954. So this is somewhat after the United States had detonated its first hydrogen bomb, and this is a very important part of the story. That's why I'm mentioning it. When the Air Force detonated its Castle series of H-bomb tests, the problem was that the Castle Bravo test had predicted a yield for that bomb of about 7.5 megatons. When they fired it off, the reaction ran away to 15 megatons, about twice the estimated reaction. Now, that in the thermonuclear chemistry business is called oops.
Yeah. When that thing went off, people were 30 miles away. They thought they were going to be immolated.
Yeah. It was just not the reaction that they were expecting. And so we were told that one of the public lines, and we're getting to Richter here, folks. Trust me.
It's a Harvey's barn moment.
It's a Harvey's barn moment. We've got the devil's always in the details with these things. We were told that the nuclear engineers that had designed the Castle Bravo bomb did not think that lithium-7, which was present in the lithium deuteride of the fuel of the bomb.
Now, what's lithium?
Lithium is the third chemical element, and it's part of the fuel in a thermonuclear bomb. In other words, a hydrogen bomb isn't really just hydrogen. It uses a mixture of lithium and deuterium, usually, which is one of the forms of heavy hydrogen, and in some cases, tritium. So a hydrogen bomb typically uses lithium deuteride as its fuel. All right. So lithium, the third element, and then deuterium, which is the heavy hydrogen.
So you have hydrogen, which has one electron and one proton in the standard
deuterium model. And deuterium with a proton and a neutron in the nucleus.
So it's like enriched hydrogen.
It's like enriched hydrogen, right? Exactly. Okay. Now, the bomb reaction ran away, and we were told that they just didn't think that the lithium-7 would enter the reaction. Well, now enter Dr. Ronald Richter, because when Juan Perón had his scientists examine what Dr. Richter was claiming to do in his reaction, Richter, first of all, claimed that he was rotating, please pay attention to that he was rotating his plasma and doing so at the Lamore precession frequency. So in other words, he's electrically rotating a plasma. And then he says that he is getting fusion reactions out of pulsing this rotating plasma with direct current electrical arc.
Well, that sounds like what happened in Silesia.
Ding, ding, ding. Yes, this is the Nazi bell. And indeed, Richter was part of that project in Nazi Germany prior to the end of the war. So the Nazis basically are taking a plasma pinch device and rotating the plasma. They were very clever in thinking, okay, we need to rotate this stuff in addition to just pulsing it or pinching it. And they deliberately counter-rotated this plasma, both mechanically, in my opinion, and electrically, and then subjected it to very high current electrical arcing. In other words, to very high current, direct current electricity. And Richter, as a result of his experiments, was claiming to get fusion reactions at temperatures far below what you would expect for a thermonuclear reaction. And he claimed to be getting it with mixtures of lithium-7. Okay. So in other words, what I suspect happens here is that the Air Force sends somebody down because it was well known that Richter had already said that you can get thermonuclear reactions from lithium-7. So in other words, the Castle Bravo story that they put out is BS. So what's really going on? Well, they're getting an extra yield from something. Now, the only thing that would gate energy into the reaction that they're not expecting is something from the medium, the lattice work of space-time itself. And before you leap to a conclusion, folks, let me spell out what I'm really saying here. Richter told the U.S. Air Force that he had done these experiments in Nazi Germany, and that what this type of plasma does was, and these are his words, it sets up a kind of cell structure in space-time, and that this cell structure in turn in the plasma can act as a transducer for the zero, what he calls, and these are his words, the 0 point energy, or to use your terms, Kelly, the Dirac sea. All right.
So now we're back to the Pauli matrices, this sort of table.
Well, but we're back to something highly important here,
right,
and that's the plasma itself. Because people have to understand that plasma is the fourth form of matter. And please hear me now, everybody. Plasma can exist in an endothermic, that is to say, a cold state. And it can exist in a very, very ultra fine state in the vast void of space itself. So, in other words, what Richter is saying is you're letting off a plasma, namely the hydrogen bomb, inside another plasma, which is the plasma of local space-time.
Well, there's probably three plasmas. You have the plasma of what happens with the spark plug.
Yes.
And then you have the plasma that's created by the initial explosion of the trigger.
Yes.
And then you have the plasma of space-time itself.
Right. Now, let's I think perhaps you're missing what I'm saying. There are huge plasma clouds that fill empty space. In my opinion, Kelly, this is the ether luminiferous of 19th century physics.
Oh, wow.
In my opinion, this is what Tesla is talking about when he says the medium. Because you must remember that Tesla's big beef with Einstein was, first of all, that Einstein, or his scientific, what would you call them, lackeys or trumpeters or
supplicants,
or publicity agents, whatever.
Yeah.
That Einstein supposedly gets rid of the ether, or that the ether of 19th century physics is a static, non-compressible ether. For Tesla, people have to understand the ether is hydrodynamic. It has properties of fluidity, and therefore is an ether that can be compressed and rarefied.
Right.
So
well,
in other words,
it has qualities of all of the dynamics.
It has qualities that Tesla himself is often touted as predicting the particle gun and so on.
Right.
What Tesla is really talking about is the solar wind. He's talking about dusty plasmas in outer space. This is what he's talking about
Oh, wow.
when he says medium. So, in other words, what I want people to take away from this is the absolute centrality of plasma physics to everything I say in all of those Giza Death Star books. There's a reason, folks, that I have been maintaining all along that the book The Cosmic War is the central book to all of my books. Why? Because I take time in that book to go into plasma physics.
Right.
Because what you're dealing with in plasma physics is a form of matter that is not atomic. Let me repeat that. You're dealing with a form of matter that is not atomic.
In a way, plasma is actually the first form of matter, and all the
In
other.
a way, yes, bing, ding, ding, ding. It's
Yeah.
a very fine matter, and it thus fits the bill for the 19th century ether perfectly. And here's the clincher. Plasmas are quite easy to manipulate and study because their principal force that they use and utilize and that manipulates them and that they manipulate is electromagnetism, not the Einsteinian gravity driven or gravity centered universe.
Yeah, the other thing is, physics has this conference every year in Europe called the Solvay conference,
Mm-hmm.
it's where all the big, especially in the 20th century, all the big luminaries would be invited, to Solvay, and to get an invitation was very coveted by physicists. It was a real honor to go there, and you'd have Dirac there, you'd have Einstein there, you'd have Bohr, Niels Bohr there. Etc. So in the 1922 Solvay conference, Einstein gave a talk,
Mm-hmm.
and in that talk, he said, when I'm doing my equations, I can't get rid of minus k, and the equations work. Now, Joseph, what did he mean by that?
Well, you tell me.
Well, he meant that basically the ether is charged, that it's still there, and you can't get rid of it.
Yeah. Okay. The reason I asked the question is in in the second book that's, I hope, at the printers now, and I hope will come out in June. And I'm literally having to bite the inside of my mouth, Kelly, because again, you're hitting on something that I don't talk about directly in the Giza Death Star Revisited.
Huh.
But it's certainly there in the book whose title I wish I could mention, but
the books that shall not be mentioned, or be
the book that shall not be mentioned.
The artist formerly known as Prince.
Well, here's the problem. Shortly after Einstein published his general relativity paper in 1916, the inventor of tensor calculus, Tullio Levi-Civita, an Italian mathematician, is the guy that invented the tensor calculus. He wrote a book on it called The Absolute Differential Calculus, which, of course, is just horribly difficult to understand. And I'm confident that I understand about 2% of it.
Wow.
But Levi-Civita actually published a short little 9-page article in an Italian mathematical journal in 1917. And the basic thrust of the short little article was that Einstein had used a form for his gravitational tensor that was nothing but mathematical gibberish.
Physicists are known to butcher mathematics. It's a common complaint among mathematicians.
Well, yeah, but this butchery is a little more significant.
Look, it's a steak you would not want to eat.
It's a well, yes, and that's pretty much the conclusion that Levi Civitar came to.
Mm.
And in the course of examining his paper, I've noticed certain little things that he says with respect to the problem that you're pointing out. Okay, so on even after Einstein publishes his general relativity, that is telling a lot of scientists, physicists, mathematicians that you cannot get rid of, even in gravity, you cannot get rid of a connection to electromagnetism.
Right.
You know, this has been the problem all along, really, if you stop and think about
Well, you
it.
can't get rid of the stress, otherwise the equations don't
Bingo, exactly. Bingo. You cannot get rid of that scalar potential because it's always going to be there.
Yeah.
And once you learn that the scalar potential is simply a zero-sum vector field, then you can actually tailor that potential by the way you construct that zero-sum vector field.
Right. So let's sort of generalize this for the audience. Imagine
Right.
a soda bottle at each point in space, and that soda bottle is closed and it's carbonated.
Right.
And so it's got all this sort of energy embedded in it.
Right.
And then you're trying to come up with equations of space-time.
Right.
And how space-time moves. And you're trying to come up with sort of like grand theories about why the Milky Way doesn't fly apart.
Yeah, that's another little problem.
Yeah. And so there's no way that you can make the equations work. And if you try to say that these bottles of Pepsi under pressure don't exist.
Right. There's no way. This is why modern theoretical physics is in such a snit, because there's no way to explain how a structure like the Milky Way galaxy holds together.
Right.
The only way you can do it is you have to invoke some sort of model that involves entanglement or non-locality. But then once you do, you're in the physics of the very small. You're in quantum mechanics.
Yeah.
And you still have yet to explain, how does this gigantic spiral structure hold together? Well, answer: throw out, and you heard me correctly, throw out Einsteinian physics and start with Tesla and his observation that an interferometry field, an electrostatic interferometry field, moves at pi divided by 2 the velocity of light.
Mm.
And folks, I'm giving you a huge hint there, because pi divided by 2 is a ratio that you discover in the Great Pyramid over and over and over and over.
And in quantum mechanics.
Ta-da!
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. My daughter will eat half a pie if I offer her one.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Yeah. So we're dealing, I'm trying to emphasize for people here, Kelly, that my speculation about the weapon hypothesis for the Great Pyramid is dealing with areas of physics that will not fit any sort of Einsteinian gravitational type of physics. You're going to have to be thinking in terms of electrical circuits, of electrical acoustic waves, of plasma.
You need to go all the way back to Faraday.
Yeah.
And start over.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And so we have this kernel obfuscating and creating the narrative for Egyptology.
Right.
You've got Maxwell, who died suspiciously. What was it, 2 years after he published his paper?
Something like that, yeah.
Yeah, suspiciously. And nobody ever talks about that. But that's, we've heard that story before.
Yep.
He maybe Maxwell was Glasgow-sided.
Yeah.
And then we have Einstein's theory that comes along, and one of the, as I related to Joseph at another time, one of the saddest days of my scientific life was opening up my first book on relativity. What a creativity devoid closed system it was.
Yeah.
And immensely frustrating for its lack of physical insight.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then you've got in the meantime, what you have is you have all these sort of real world experimental physics results coming out.
Yep.
That are constantly bucking the narrative attempts to control what
Yep.
people are thinking is possible with physics.
Yep.
So you have Maxwell came out with a theory. You have explaining a lot of what Faraday had discovered, and then you had Heaviside come out and tamp it down, right? And then you had Tesla come along and see the whole picture from galaxies on down, including the ability to give people free energy and have airplanes flying around with no tether and no battery, right? And then you've got the sort of discovery of the electron, and the modern theory of the electron, and the hydrogen atom by Bohr, and then you got a whole bunch of other efforts to nobody wanted to discuss 1/137, defined structure constant, which is if you want to,
and they still don't want to discuss it.
Yeah, like think of it like the boundaries between the colors of light that's put through a prism. Right, you see this sort of structure emerge in these quantum experiments that looks like the way the colors organize on a prism, and nobody can explain it. And then you've got quantum mechanics. So in order to be able to cover everything over, I think they migrated to a statistical mechanics model, which is where we get quantum theory, which is like we can't tell you what's going to happen in every individual experiment because we just don't know what's going to happen in one experiment.
Well, the problem here, as far as I'm concerned, is relativity itself. Having spent 20 plus years now thinking about alternative physics, at every turn I keep coming up against the inutility of that whole system, that whole theory. There's something I mentioned in the second book, and I might as well let at least one little cat out of the bag. On the model of the sun that you and I and every person listening to us has been taught, we have been taught to view the sun as a big chained up hydrogen bomb. And that this huge bomb is constantly exploding, and what prevents it from flying apart is the gigantic gravitational attraction that keeps all of that plasma, please note the term there, under stress and under a constant state of exploding. Okay, that's the model. Okay,
but that would assume that each sun would be of a relatively uniform size.
Again, possibly, yes. But here's the bigger problem. The bigger problem is what happened in May of 1999. The solar wind stopped for 2 days.
Oh my goodness.
Now, folks, if the sun is a big chained up hydrogen bomb under the standard model, you don't turn it off for 2 days. It just does not happen. It does not happen.
I had never heard of that. That's amazing.
It's on NASA's website.
Wow.
So in other words, you can take all of that gravitational relativistic crap about stars and their reactions and throw it right into the wastebasket.
So what if we consider the stars under Richter's model?
If you consider the stars under Richter's model, you're dealing with open systems.
Right.
And as plasmas, they are in relationship to what? Other plasmas.
Right.
Okay. So
gating stress from the medium.
Gating stress from the medium. Yes, exactly.
Yeah. Bringing things through
Right.
the gateway of the three-dimensional surface of the Dirac Sea.
Right. Exactly.
Which
So,
is what happened in Castle Bravo.
well, yes, that's exactly so. And the other thing that we have to remember here is that the sun is actually cooler as you go towards its core.
That's amazing.
So, in other words, the photosphere of the sun is actually much cooler. It's only a few thousands of degrees Celsius than the corona of the sun, which is, of course, a few million degrees Celsius. So, in other words, we're talking about orders of magnitude. And again, that model makes no sense on the chained up hydrogen bomb model.
Oh my God, what a joke.
Yeah. So, in other words, if, and let's remember, Kelly, who gave us this chained up hydrogen bomb model of the sun. Why? It was Sir Arthur Eddington. And what else did Sir Arthur Eddington do? Well, during the 1921 eclipse, to test for the truthfulness of Einstein's general relativity, the famous experiment where, they demonstrated that Einstein's prediction was that the sun would bend light. The problem was Eddington fudged the numbers and got rid of all the data that fell outside of the predicted values that Einstein came up with in general relativity for the bending of light.
Now, the British seem to be coming up in an inordinate number of these cases.
You've noticed that, have you? Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Just like Tom Bearden, and I think Bearden's onto something, although he's never given much explanation for where he's getting his idea from. But Bearden came up with the idea that the Lorentz transforms were something that J.P. Morgan more or less dictated somebody come up with. So, and you and I both know that those sets of equations play a huge role in special.
Yeah, well, they're kind of an averaging function.
They're an averaging function. Yeah, they're let's call them what they are. They're an accounting trick.
Yeah. Yeah, when you average things, you get rid of a lot of the detail.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And getting rid of detail seems to be part of the plan.
Yep, exactly.
Yeah, they got rid of the details of Maxwell. They got rid of the details through Eddington. They got through Einstein, they got rid of the details. I mean, it all seems to be about the details. And then when the data doesn't fit, the new measurements of the satellites they're putting up to observe the universe upstairs, and the data doesn't fit, then they have it's dark matter, then it's dark energy.
Yeah. And well, stop and think how much of these mathematical artifacts from the general relativity cosmos, which dark matter and dark energy are, how much of that can be explained by the assumption that it's plasma?
Yeah.
Well, quite a bit, as a matter of fact.
Yeah, if you consider it the first state of matter and work from that point forward, you'll have a lot more success.
Right.
And you won't have to fudge your Michelson-Morley experiment either.
No, you won't. And this is why I think front and center people have to understand that plasma physics, there's a reason why I put it front and center in the cosmic war. And there's a reason why I've spent so much time with the Giza Death Star weapon hypothesis, basically making electroacoustics or plasma or whatever you wish to call it front and center, because this is the only way that the hypothesis actually works. So what I want people to take away from this, if there's one thing to take away from it, the next time you look up at the sun, I want you to remember these words: not a chained up hydrogen bomb.
Right. Yeah. Well, and besides the fact is, if you look at we know what hydrogen bombs put out because we can measure it. And if you do a spectral analysis of what the sun puts out, there's no match to it at all.
Well, yeah, the biggest problem for physicists has been, ever since Nikolai Kozyrev pointed this out in the Soviet Union, that the sun is just not spitting out nearly enough neutrinos,
right,
as it should be under the chained up hydrogen bomb model.
Right.
So there's another physics altogether that's going on there.
And that's what we find in the Great Pyramid.
And that's what you find in the Great Pyramid. Exactly.
So how does Tesla relate to the Great Pyramid then?
Well, Tesla came up with his Colorado Springs experiments due to something that he noticed one day tinkering around and experimenting in his laboratory in New York. He noticed a very strange phenomenon, and leave it to Tesla to notice a common thing that any electrical engineer at the time would have experienced, but probably would have just dismissed it. Tesla, of course, thought that the experience was unique and needed to be investigated. And that was when he closed a circuit of extremely high voltage electricity, there would be a momentary abrupt shock that would penetrate through any physical barriers that he erected between him and the circuit apparatus itself. And that shock, moreover, would be of an electrostatic nature. In other words, we've all been around a strong electrostatic field and we feel goosebumps or the hair on our arms or legs stand up and so on and so forth. Well, this is what he was experiencing. So he decided to investigate this phenomenon further. And in the course of investigating it, he discovered that at the moment of the closure of the circuit, an extremely high voltage direct current would not move through the circuit, but for that brief moment over the circuit.
Yeah, you can hear that when you turn on your stereo and it goes bounce.
Yeah, you can hear it when you turn on any electrical equipment. There's a sudden spike as the current meets the resistance barrier of the circuit.
Right.
Now, in my attempt to kind of re-engineer what I think Tesla was thinking, I use the example of a belly flop. When you dive off the swimming pool diving board into the swimming pool and you belly flop, what you're doing is you're at that very instant that you hit the surface of the water, the barrier of the surface throws up an infinite resistance to what energy you're putting into it. And at that brief moment, because of that, the water itself, the medium, spreads out in a big splash until your kinetic energy overcomes the declining resistance of the surface and you enter the water. So what Tesla's doing in his experiments at Colorado Springs is he's opening and closing that circuit extremely rapidly. He's breaking the connection almost as soon as he closes it. So he's getting a constant output of these pulsations of electroacoustic energy against the circuit. And what his discovery is when you change the circuit parameters, when you make the segments of the circuit itself multi-segmented and asymmetrical, the effect is multiplied dramatically. So in other words, if you can think of the Great Pyramid now as a circuit in that kind of system, you have a building which is made of several segments of rock, stones, millions of stones, and each stone comprising billions of tiny little quartz crystals. So if you pulse that, if you hit it with a pulse, electroacoustic pulse of some sort, it's going to build up a tremendous energy at the very top as that waveform moves over the surface of the segments of the circuit. Follow me?
Yep.
Once you get to the top, that's where the concentration becomes almost infinite. You're squeezing that pulse into a waveguide that increasingly narrows until it's a very fine point. And once it's at that point, that pulse enters the medium itself. This is why I think during World War II, the British warned their pilots, do not fly over the pyramids at Giza because it will mess up your instruments.
Interesting.
sitting there and squatting there without all the components missing from the structure still generates some sort of an effect, some sort of field that is concentrated above that site.
Wow. So when you say it goes into the medium, what do you mean by that?
I mean that dealing throughout all of his experiments, he's dealing with electrical shock waves. So, in other words, we're used to thinking of electromagnetic broadcast as things like radio or television, which are Hertz waves, sine waves. These travel slower than the velocity of light, and the energy on the load end is considerably declined, and the reason is the S wave itself. So imagine a jump rope suspended between two people, and one person jerks the rope up and down. That's your typical electromagnetic sine wave. In that jerk, most of the energy is expended. What transmits through the wave to the other person is a fraction of the energy that produces.
I think we talked about that last time. So
Right.
The question is, into the medium, does it mean that energy being collated and amplified by the structure of the pyramid itself as it's traveling upward, and it goes into the medium, does it mean it's passing the gateway back in?
Gateway back into what?
Into the fine structure, into the
Yes,
ether.
that's what I'm saying.
Right. So it goes into the ether, and then what happens?
Well, depending on how you're tuning it, and again, this is a wave that is tuned to a particular target. It's modulated like a radio wave. If it's tuned to a particular target, that energy will emerge at that target. And the way you tune it is the configuration of the geometry of the wave itself. In other words, you're producing a wave that is naturally resonant to a particular geometric configuration in space-time. And that result means that the wave is only going to emerge at that particular place and time with all of that force.
Oh, wow. So we're back to Tunguska.
We're back to Tunguska, yeah.
Or Turkey.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah. So this thing basically disappears.
Yeah.
And then at some, space-time coordinate.
Yep.
It comes bursting out.
Yep.
And you don't have any warning it's coming. It's not like you see the missile coming over the horizon.
No.
There's no early warning system.
Now you can configure it in such a way that it will give you warnings. Okay. In other words, let's assume that you want to blow up Tiamat. Okay.
Yeah.
And you decide that you're going to do it in slow degrees rather than just all at once. So what you do is you start loading energy into the planet that the planet cannot damp. And as a result of that, the planet increasingly experiences ever more severe earthquakes.
Like cavitation,
more and more widespread until finally it just blows apart.
Right.
So you can do it that way as well. Why you would want to do it, I don't know, unless you're particularly mean and practicing a particularly mean kind of psychological warfare. But you can do it that way. And that's one of the things that some of those ancient texts, in particular things like the Enema Elish, indicate actually happened.
And so it's interesting that the most important page in the Elish is missing.
Yeah, well, it is. Yeah, it makes you wonder just exactly what is missing and why is it missing and what are they holding back.
Right, because there's all kinds of things that are missing.
Mm-hmm. But even the stuff that did get out is very suggestive.
Right.
So, my point has always been that if you look at what they're talking about in these texts, they are very suggestive. One of the texts I point out in the book is the Edfu Temple texts, where the weapon is called the sound eye.
Yeah.
Well, there's your electroacoustics right there.
Right. So if you've got this thing you're calling a waveguide, right?
Right.
The way for the listeners to think about a waveguide is imagine a clear pipe.
Right.
Okay, but it's a pipe made up of acoustic energy.
Right.
And then you're feeding this plasma, these plasma pulses through this acoustic pipe.
Right.
That's your waveguide.
That's your waveguide. Yeah. And again, it is a plasma, and plasmas do have an internal cellular structure. In other words, they are quasi-crystalline in nature. And if you look at the way I've argued that the pyramid and the missing components in it, well, some of the missing components I'm arguing were crystalline structures that were both optically and acoustically resonant to particular frequencies.
Wow.
And that they used indices of refraction of a very advanced nature. In other words, they were metamaterials of some sort designed to trap light inside the crystal. In other words, to produce little mini singularities of a crystalline structure, and it's those structures that, in my opinion, allowed the device to be tuned. And these, in turn, existed inside the Grand Gallery. And I think there are two indicators that something existed in the Grand Gallery at one time that is no longer there. The first indicator is Chris Dunn and the way he looks at the structure of the Grand Gallery and comes to the conclusion, well, it's an acoustical chamber, a resonating chamber that was designed to hold Helmholtz resonators, banks and banks of Helmholtz resonators, which are simply kind of circular versions of flutes that produce a certain tone as air current is blown over a hollow sphere. Okay. In my opinion, these resonating assemblies were actually these kinds of special crystals. And the reason I say that is that in Sitchin's analysis of texts, he's analyzing certain passages in texts that, in his opinion, refer directly to the Great Pyramid. And one passage in particular in some of this, the Sumerian text, the Lugal A, talks about the being that's doing the inventorying of the components of the Great Pyramid walking up and down inside a chamber that is full of radiant light, like a prism. So again, this is the Grand Gallery.
Wow.
Yeah, there's so much going on in these texts, and again, I think Sitchin is right for reasons that I get into in the second book, that some of these texts have to be read in reference to the Great Pyramid. Absolutely have to be read that way.
Well, first of all, there's no other choice, which isn't conclusive by any means.
Right.
But the case, it's such an exact fit.
Yes, it is.
That it would be ludicrous to suggest that it's not the case.
Well, wait till you see the second book and a particular thing in the second book.
Yeah.
It really kind of cinches the case very, very directly. But
so we've seen how this thing conjugates energy, and last time we talked about hydrogen, and we talked about this plasma moving through these corridors inside the pyramid. Right. You mentioned toroidal or twisting, structures or processes in Richter's work, and also in the Nazi Bell,
right?
And probably inside the Viracocha device. Yeah, and the hydrogen bomb. There's got to be something toroidal going on because of the design of the chamber.
As a matter of fact, there is, but people are going to have to wait for the second book to come out.
All right.
No, I don't want to go there right now.
Okay.
Because it's connected to the most radical bit of this whole story.
Yeah.
Which we haven't even touched on. But
yeah.
But
I haven't gotten to my question yet. So what is the evidence for toroidal processes in the function of the Great Pyramid?
Okay. I think any time that you have plasma under certain conditions, that there is going to be a toroidal effect. And one of the things, and again, I don't talk about it in this pyramid book. It was certainly present in my mind, but I saved talking about it to the second book.
Okay. You mean
Okay.
the fifth book?
Or you can go to the Cosmic War, where I do talk about it openly, and people are going to wonder, why is he talking about this?
That's what I did when I read the book. I was like, well, this is kind of a non sequitur.
All right. Yes, it is a non sequitur, because I wasn't at that time able to talk about the whole story.
Mm-hmm.
But I was able to put certain things out there that people might want to think about.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Plasmas under certain conditions of electrical stress will develop parallel electrical currents or channels, to use your term. And when those parallel currents come close to each other, they will twist into a helix.
Like a caduceus.
Like a caduceus, or like a DNA helix.
Yeah.
They will twist into a helix shape rather than short out.
Oh, interesting. So, so basically, it's like an eternal braid. It's like a plasma braid.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, I strongly suspect that under certain conditions, if the plasma is not terribly hot and is under tremendous electromagnetic stress, that these filamentary structures will automatically result, and that they in turn will twist themselves into toroids or donuts. And this is particularly true, and I'm not going to say why I know this, but this is particularly true under extremely hot plasma stress. Yeah.
Well, it's interesting if you look at the way that a neutron moves. It moves in a toroidal fashion.
Yes, exactly. And there, you're dealing once again with something that is really without a good explanation. But
this kind of reminds me a little bit about tornadoes too. I mean, it sounds.
Well, hang on. The other reason that the pyramids at Giza, and please note I've shifted now from Great Pyramid to pyramids, are involving a twist, is that the second pyramid, the pyramid of Sephron at Giza, and that, folks, is actually the pyramid depicted in the cover art of the fourth book. What you're looking at, I don't know why my publisher did that, but you're not looking at the Great Pyramid. No, Shiloh, lay down. You're looking
the one with the cap on it.
Yes, the pyramid with the cap on it is not the Great Pyramid. That's the second pyramid. That's the pyramid of Sephron.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. The pyramid of Sephron is almost as fascinating a structure as the Great Pyramid, because Sir Flinders Petrie, when he took measurements of that structure, was able to determine that the casing stones that remain at the top of that pyramid are slightly off of perfect alignment, and that there's a slight twist in that pyramid as you ascend from the floor or the ground level up to the apex of the pyramid. It twists.
You can actually see that in the cover of the book.
Yeah, you can actually kind of see the twist.
It's torqued.
Yeah. Now, Petrie assumed, as do most alternative researchers, that this represents a slight decline in the standards of perfection and construction, and that twist is actually a quote unquote a mistake. I think, on the contrary, that twist is no decline at all, that it represents a necessary component for a waveguide that is designed to twist a pulse, and that twist is just like the rifling in a cannon or a
Or
gun,
or the sub rings at CERN.
or the sub rings at CERN. It's exactly like the rifling in a gun barrel.
Yeah.
It's designed to twist. In
Well,
this case, you're twisting the waveguide itself for the plasma pulse.
yeah. So when someone boots the pyramid, right, and it starts to vibrate and build up its tremendous and varied energy and
Right.
vibration,
Right.
it's going to start to affect the other pyramids.
Yes, exactly.
And so then they start to resonate
Yes.
in response to what's happening inside the Cheops device.
Yes.
And then it starts resonating back to the pyramid in this twisted beam, this twisted configuration.
Right.
So it's not sending back the same. It's not a phase conjugate mirror. It's actually out of phase.
It's out of phase. Yes.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
a phase conjugate mirror is basically, well, it's kind of too complicated to get into, but in general, think of it as it's a way to create a perfect image of something. Like if you're working with holograms, scientists at MIT, for example, when they're working with holograms, are constantly using phase conjugate mirror.
Let me give an example that will help people. A phase conjugate mirror takes a picture of an atmospheric distortion, okay, and then shines a laser through the picture of the distortion so that what emerges is a coherent laser itself. In other words, the phase conjugate mirror reverses the normal dispersion, atmospheric dispersion of light. All right, that's what it does.
And so you get the actual image of whatever that thing is flying that's picked up.
Right, but here's the clincher. To form a phase conjugate mirror, the absolute requirement for the mirror itself is that it be a non-linear material.
Right.
Like rock or like plasma.
Or quartz glass.
Exactly. Right.
Right. So anyway, so you got the second pyramid, and the signal it's sending back is twisted.
Right.
And that's being incorporated back into the stream of the big pyramid.
Well, again, you're speculating here beyond what I do in the book.
Okay.
Okay. I do not view the pyramid of Sephron as having been built at the same time as the Great Pyramid. And I view the pyramid of Menkaure, the third pyramid at Giza, the much smaller one than the other two, as having been built even later than Sephron. So in other words, for me, the compound at Giza is a multi-millennium project, okay? I am only concerned in the book with the Great Pyramid itself, which does not need the other pyramids.
Right.
It's Chris Dunn who suggests that the other pyramids are there to help increase the efficiency of the Great Pyramid in achieving whatever resonance that it does. And I have no difficulty with that point of view. But you do not need the other pyramids in order for the Great Pyramid weapon function to work.
Mm-hmm.
And the other thing that people need to be aware of is that the other pyramids do not have near the internal complexity of the Great Pyramid, and they do not have nearly the same sort of dimensional analogs to local celestial space-time that the Great Pyramid does. So they are not, my point being here that the Great Pyramid is something sui generis.
Mm-hmm.
It's something absolutely unique unto itself. No other pyramidal structure on the planet, let alone at Giza, has nearly the redundancy in terms of these types of mathematical analogs as does the Great Pyramid.
So may they have functioned as a resistor capacitor?
They could, yes, they could. And if you look at the Giza compound as a whole, something I do point out in the book is that the compound is capable of rotating in a kind of virtual rotation. And when you do that, you get a very interesting result.
Whoa. So you're saying that the compound itself or the pyramids themselves?
If you look top down,
Yeah.
aerial view of the compound.
Right. I see it in my mind.
Okay. Now rotate the compound 120 degrees, take a picture and overlay it with the original starting position. Rotate it another 120 degrees, in other words, 240 degrees, using the apex of the Great Pyramid as the axis of rotation. Take the picture, overlay it. And now take that whole result and rotate it again 60 degrees. And what do you get?
No idea.
You get a Mogan David.
What's that?
A Star of David.
Oh my God.
And that, of course, oh boy. Shiloh.
Do you want to take a break here? We could take a 5-minute break, Joseph.
I don't know. It's just the.
You can go to the restroom or whatever.
Well, I don't want to lose the Mogan David thought.
Okay, so go. Why don't you finish that out?
The Mogan David, if you think of it in a certain way, is what? It's a two-dimensional analog or representation of a three-dimensional ortho-rotated two tetrahedra circumscribed in a sphere that are ortho-rotated. That's what it is. And we know who's made that diagram and that concept rather famous.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you have embedded in the geometry of Giza a virtual rotation that produces this figure.
Whoa.
Right.
Well, that makes, so were all three built at the same time?
No, I just said that they were not. Once again, I point this out in the book. That, hang on. Shiloh.
The canine security unit.
Shiloh. Thank you, but go lay down. Sorry about that. She just was going ballistic.
Yeah, well, that's what you pay her for.
Yeah, true. Where were we? Oh, the layers. No, again, I talk about the layers of construction in the book. And I'm with Alan Alford. I have always been with Alan Alford. There are 3 layers of construction at Giza. The Great Pyramid is sui generis, and it's the oldest. The Pyramid of Sephron, the Valley Temples, the Sphinx come from a second, later layer of construction. And please note that if those things are a second later layer, this would date to about 8,000 BC, because that's when the best dating for the water erosion on the Sphinx occurs.
Oh, wow.
So in other words, if the Great Pyramid is already there at that place, then that's older than the Sphinx. Then you have the third layer of construction, which is purely Egyptian.
Right.
So in other words, this site, for whatever reason, has been a site of concentrated building for whatever purpose for millennia. And the real question is why. And that question I get into in the second book.
Oh, wow. So Cairo means space-time as opposed to Greenwich Mean Time.
Yeah, Cairo space-time. Yeah. Cairo mean time.
Yeah.
Or Giza mean time. That's the prime meridian.
Right. And it's also, it looks like to me, if you just look at a map of the Earth, the land masses on the Earth, it seems like it's pretty close to the center of mass.
It is, yes. This is something that has been pointed out. It was first pointed out by the Astronomer Royal of Scotland, Piazzi Smythe.
Yeah.
It's been part of pyramid lore ever since then. And Piazzi Smythe made the point, which he accompanied with that famous diagram now, that if you look at the location of Giza, it's almost in the exact center of the exact geographic center of the surface landmass of the Earth,
Right.
which is exactly where you'd want an oscillator of the planet to be.
Right. And you also, get the contribution of all those nonlinear materials strewn all over the Earth.
Bingo. Bingo. But there's another reason it's located there, but I won't get into that. That's for the second book.
All right. Wow. So we have, the suppression of scientific knowledge,
Right.
and diversion into these useful Heaviside style diversions.
Right.
And then we have, the poly matrices appearing in Dirac's paper, which had never been seen before in published work, as far as I know. And nobody ever talks about what they mean. They just show up in that theory. And then, like, where's this coming from? What does it mean? Nobody ever talks about it. I even looked through Wolfgang Pauli's scientific biography. I was like, oh, I should be able to find something about that in there. They talk about the matrices in a couple paragraphs.
Yep.
And they don't explain anything about what they're talking about. All right. So I got no further. There's a complete wall over what Wolfgang Pauli was really working on. And what was his association with the Manhattan Project? Was he involved in that?
No, he was not.
Right.
Pauli's most esoteric bit of research was the work he did with Carl Jung on the fine structure constant and on synchronicity.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, they were in the same city.
Yes.
And Pauli knew this wealthy woman who was friends with Jung and got introduced, I recall.
Yes, that's exactly right.
Yeah,
exactly
and so
right.
he started going, hanging out with Jung, who was into sort of this subconscious symbolic construction of human consciousness.
Well, they were both fascinated by the fine structure constant and exchanged a series of correspondence about it.
Yeah.
On my website in my members area, I have a little webinar on the fine structure constant and what was going on with them with that.
Yeah, and that's not an endlessly repeating number, is it?
The decimal coefficient form, 729976 or something like that.
Yeah.
The decimal form is, if I remember correctly, a non-repeating number like pi.
Oh, like an irrational number, non-repeating.
Yeah, right. Wow.
Those irrational numbers are the ones that make the most sense.
Well, they do. The fractional form of the fine structure constant 1/137.
Yeah.
Is like 22/7 for pi. In other words, when you look at the Great Pyramid, it often expresses these physical constants as fractions rather than as decimals.
Well, that would make sense.
It's a harmonic, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's the pipe organ.
It's the pipe organ.
Has anybody ever put a fine structure constant analog into an organ?
Into a pipe organ? No, not to my, well. If you view the Great Pyramid as a kind of gigantic pipe organ,
yeah,
I do a little bit of that in the part of the book you haven't reached yet.
Yeah, I did see it. I did briefly go through it. I'm reading this new book by Dr. Farrell, and I every couple of paragraphs I have to stop and put the book down because I got to think about it.
Yeah, it's one of those kinds of books for sure.
Yeah, you just can't take it all. If you take it all in one fell swoop, you're not going to be able to deal. You're not going to be able to get there. And so I've been putting it down. So I'm only like 92 pages into the book now, and I want to get to the good part, even though it's not the good part. But I'm just holding myself back to make sure I have all the pieces, so that I understand what happens when I get there.
Well, you have to understand. I don't myself claim to fully understand how this thing worked. What I'm doing my level best to do is reverse engineer what I think may come approximately close.
Are there any? Was there a control room for this thing? What was the control room? You know,
Well,
the
this
breakers.
is the biggest problem with the weapon hypothesis, is that you're dealing with a structure that is an analog structure.
Right.
So how do you control it? How do you do this? What appliances or what have you are there to tune the
To
instrument?
tune it, yeah.
Yeah. And again, my thinking is that all of that was removed from the structure when those internal components were destroyed, according to the texts.
Yeah, I mean, if you killed the control surfaces, you know, if you had
Right.
an airplane and you just took away the flap levers, the steering wheel, and the throttle column, you wouldn't be able to go anywhere.
You wouldn't be able to go anywhere, and you'd be mystified. You know, if you didn't know
Yeah,
anything about flight, you'd be mystified as why would anybody build such an absurd thing? You
right.
know,
Yeah,
it's kind of like what we're trying to do, looking at this absurd structure sitting in the middle of Egypt
yeah,
obviously somebody took a great deal of time to design and build,
yeah.
not to mention expense.
Can
But
you, can you
what the heck was it for?
can you imagine the architect of the Great Pyramid reading in the modern newspaper what they think that it was an Airbnb for a pharaoh?
Well, yeah, yeah, exactly. I'm sure that the architect, whoever he or she was, is having a howler,
Yeah,
trying to
he's rolling over in his sarcophagus.
rolling over, yeah, howling with laughter. But no, the point is well taken. We're all guessing here, and there's no other way around to the fact that we're guessing. Hopefully our guesses are well argued and make some sort of sense, and good enough guesses that somebody else will be able to pile on and work off of them. But
So was the Tablet of Destinies? I mean, there is a connection between the Tablets of Destinies and the pyramid,
yes,
right? So the Tablet of Destinies, was that kind of like the coordinate book, like, when you're an aviation pilot, an instrument pilot, when you're a visual pilot in good weather, you just have one map, right?
right,
And but when you're an instrument pilot, you have this chart book.
right,
And so for an instrument pilot, the charts contain all the information about how to go into an airport when you can't see.
right,
Right. So in a way, the chart book for an IFR pilot is the tablet of destinies
right,
for that pilot, right?
right,
How do I get to Baltimore?
right,
And how do I get into the airport when you can't see, right?
right.
So the tablets of destinies, was that like the recipe book for dialing in what you wanted the
Well,
pyramid to do?
that's kind of what I present in the Cosmic War.
Right.
But I think it will become clear by the end of this book, certainly by the end of the second book,
Right.
that the tablets of destinies were probably these crystal resonator arrays. All right. Now that doesn't mean that I've compromised my view one iota that they are pardon me, that they are biometrically activated.
So was any of that connected to astrology in any meaningful
Oh,
way?
absolutely. Oh, yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Pardon me. You've got to remember, and I point this out later in the book, every crystal has a lattice structure of nodes and lattice defects that are the product of the space-time geometry in which they're grown. So every crystal grown in a gravity intense environment like planet Earth is going to produce a set of crystalline defects as a result of that environment, chemical and gravitational environment.
So if you came across an Earth sapphire on Talos 4 in the Star Trek series,
Right.
you were analyzing it in your lab, you could reverse engineer and figure out that it's one from Earth.
Yes. Yes. If you have a sufficiently advanced science of, and I even invent the term later in the book, crystal historiography.
Oh, wow.
If you have a sufficiently advanced science, you would be able to kind of read the biography of that crystal and the conditions under which it was grown.
So if you have,
Now,
yeah,
don't
all right,
interrupt. This is very important.
I promise.
It means that the older the crystal is, the more it will be resonant to the first conditions in which it was created. This is why you have traditions in occult lore of crystals that are actually the foundation stone of the cosmos.
Oh wow.
Yeah,
Boy, that's a, that's definitely, put in your pipe and smoke it.
that's a put it
Congratulations.
in your pipe and smoke it. Yes. And there's another thing that people have to remember: plasmas are quasi crystalline in nature.
Wow. So in the Cosmic War, when you talk about the political and military struggle between with Tiamat, and it was Tiamat and the Earth, right?
It was Tiamat and all the other planets,
On
in
all the
my
other
opinion,
planets.
but
So
primarily the Earth. Yes.
so were they stealing stones from each other and trying to plug them into the pyramid?
I actually, my reading is exactly the same as Zechariah Sitchin's. The stones are already there, and they're using this structure and the stones from it. And later on, this is the problem with the texts, and people have to understand this. If you look at certain Egyptian texts, they will tell you that these cosmic wars are at least two in numbers, kind of like Cosmic War One and Cosmic War Two. Okay, like our World War One and World War Two. If you look at the Mesopotamian text, it's just like Cosmic War One, and that's it. If you look at the Vedic texts, you get several wars, little big wars that are all parts of a big war. Okay. If you look at the Greek text, you've got the Gigantomachy, which is the really big cosmic war, and then you get a bunch of little wars afterwards. So it depends on the text and the tradition you're citing. This is why I leave the scaffolding of exact chronology to others. My whole point and focus is, number one, these cosmic wars occurred, and number two, they occurred utilizing powerful weapons. Now, exactly when the Great Pyramid was used in this is anybody's guess, but my guess is it makes its first appearance, it or something very much like it makes its first appearance in Cosmic War One. And if the Edfu temple texts are correct, the whole thing is torn down, destroyed, and then along comes another group of ne'er-do-wells and they rebuild the whole thing. So it depends on who you're talking to in these texts. I can't be more clear because I'm reading all of the texts all at once, and there are detailed contradictions between them. There's no two ways about it.
Which sort of gets back to that discussion we had last time about metrology. Is we could be
Right.
talking about two different events,
Right.
with respect to similar, different groups in charge of the weapon, for
Right.
example.
Exactly.
Somebody gets control of it, and all of a sudden,
Well, this is exactly the scenario that emerges from Sitchin's reading of the same text. You've got one group of people in control of this structure, they use it, and then another group of people takes
yeah,
the structure over, and they do the inventory and they destroy part of it.
yeah, that's sort of analogous to Pornell and Niven's book about an asteroid strike on the Earth. It's very interesting in this context because, basically civilization ends from the comet strike. Lucifer's Hammer was the name of the book.
Right.
And in Lucifer's Hammer, what happens is that there are individual warring groups, warlords, and their minions using the remnants of technology to try to take over a nuclear power plant that's still operational.
Oh, jeez.
Yeah,
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, that's the kind of scenario, Lucy, I think you're dealing with here.
yeah.
Is
No,
is that there are wars fought for possession of this thing, or if not for this thing, then for what's inside it.
right.
Those all important crystals.
Yeah, because it seems that it's not just an accidental function. It's sort of like the vacuum tubes in an amplifier.
Exactly.
If you don't have the right vacuum tubes, it's just a hunk of metal and plastic.
Right. Yeah. That's what we're dealing with the Great Pyramid. It's just a big pile of rock.
Right. Right. And it's still active.
And it's still active. Yep.
Yeah. Don't fly over it.
Exactly. Don't fly.
Yeah. That's amazing. So, so you have, has anybody come out critical of Sitchin's analysis in a way that had a measurable impact on your work?
Critical of him?
Yeah.
Well, yeah, the typical problem that academics have had with Sitchin, and it had a major part on why I have used translations of those texts in addition to Sitchin's own.
So you went to the academic texts.
Yes.
Because you didn't want to be subjected to criticism that you chose Sitchin. And then I think I recall that you actually found out that Sitchin's was pretty good.
Well, yes, my problem has never been Sitchin's translations per se.
Right.
My problem really is with those academics that have problems with his translation. I'm thinking of one individual in particular who just recently died, so I don't want to mention his name. God rest his soul. But my problem has been more with the academics that have problems with his translations.
Yeah.
So I avoid the translation argument in the books by using academically approved and authored translations.
Yeah, which show that the Epic of Ninurta and the Enuma Elish or Enuma Elish, are not creation fables.
No, they're not creation fables at all.
Right.
You literally have to be a dunce to swallow academia's explanation for that one.
Again, we run into the prepared narrative situation.
Right. It's a prepared narrative.
Yeah.
And this is what they've tried to do with Sitchin.
Right.
But when you get right down to it, if you compare the translations of certain texts, and I do this very directly in this second book, because I'm dealing with a particular epigraph that I reinserted into this fourth book. You know what the epigraph is.
Yeah.
I'm dealing with that epigraph and Sitchin's translation of it, and I go to other academic texts to show you, not so much that Sitchin has mistranslated it, but simply to show you that you can read even those other texts in the way that Sitchin reads them. So in other words, I'm trying to get rid of this translation saw argument that we so often hear from people that don't know anything about actual processes of translation. I've translated texts myself back in my theological writing days from the Greek into English. And I know how difficult translation is. And it's not as if people are setting out when they translate something to intentionally deceive you. It's just not the way translators work. I don't care who you are as a translator. Sitchin, the other thing that people need to understand about Sitchin is he's not terribly good at presenting his argument in an academic way.
Mm.
But he is presenting an argument for why the texts that he's using, particularly in reference to the Great Pyramid, must be understood as referring to the Great Pyramid. And the argument that he's using is actually contextual rather than simply textual. And I pointed this out in the fourth book in a very brief way. I pointed out again in a very direct and very deliberate way in the second book. And that context is that in early Sumerian inscriptions, actual artwork, the pyramids are depicted. But the pyramids being depicted are not the stepped pyramid, ziggurat pyramids of Mesopotamia. And in some cases, you're dealing not just with smooth-sided pyramids, but you're dealing with two smooth-sided pyramids.
Huh.
So that when the text says that you're dealing with something in an Æther, which is the Akkadian term for a mountain or a pyramid, and the Sumerians are drawing pictures of smooth-sided pyramids, Sitchin is saying that the context of these texts is given by these pictures.
Oh,
and that context is not in Mesopotamia, because
wow.
Mesopotamians don't build smooth-sided pyramids.
Well, and even Ninurta, the combat badge for the Ninurta operation was two pyramids with
right,
with a being in the middle of them.
Trust me, that little seal is just the tip of Sitchin's argument.
Wow.
But
it's a very significant tip, though.
It's a very significant tip. But I assure you that the other parts of the tip that are in the second book, if you're not convinced now, you will be by the end of that part.
Yeah. So these are effectively these images, these symbols that are put in there are equivalent to date lines.
Right.
And locations for news articles.
Bingo.
Like the Associated Press, Buenos Aires, right? That tells you
exactly. And that's a very good analogy, and I'm glad that you made it, because what the early Sumerian depictions are doing is, if you're taking them as Sitchin does as the context for the text,
yeah,
then what those pictures are doing is they are dating these things to a period prior to dynastic Egypt.
Yeah, well, we've already dispensed with that argument.
Yeah.
It's that argument is a joke.
Yeah, it really is.
It's a joke.
It's not only a joke. I think it's an intentional distraction. In other words, I think physics has been intentionally presented a particular way to the public so that the really good secret stuff that they want to keep secret, they can have. And the same thing is going on with respect to ancient civilizations and their technologies. I absolutely think that.
Yeah. It's like what, all that alien paraphernalia around Roswell.
Yeah, exactly.
It's the same model.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
Right.
Now,
so
there's a big whopper in this. And the thing that I think has possibly been known for a very long time that they want to keep secret is the subject of that second book, and therefore the subject of that epigraph.
Wow. Yeah, well, that is quite an enigmatic epigraph.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is.
Yeah, it's it reminds me of one of the things that Bohm said about why he stopped working with plasmas.
Ding, ding, ding.
Yeah. So David Bohm was, he was on the leading edge.
He was, yeah. He and a lot of other physicists, Kapitsa, Kamenetsky, Irving Longmire, people like this have been suspecting something for a very long time, and we need to go there now. Let's wait till the second book comes out.
All right, yeah, because it's put on your tinfoil hats.
Yeah.
For more than just the humor factor.
Well, the second book cannot be read. It should not be read, in my opinion, apart from the fourth book, the Giza Death Star Revisited.
Right.
It can stand on its own, certainly, but I intend it as kind of appendix, revision, and extension of remarks.
Right. Yeah. Well, there's some very interesting, supplements in the text of the new book, the fourth book.
Yes.
When you're recounting the text of the second book,
right,
the Giza Death Star Deployed,
right,
you've made some interesting, bold-faced additions to that really clarify.
Yeah.
Even I, who have a science background and studied science journalism, had to really, buckle up to get through those three books.
Yeah.
Because there's a lot of physics in there, and there's a lot of different kinds of physics. It's not like, when you go to a course in MIT, they have it all the way we've been educated is completely wrong. It's backwards because, you go into a topic like optics, for example, and you take this open courseware at MIT, and, you're just solidly in optics. So all they're talking about is optics. So when you get to a series like the pyramid books that you've written, it's completely flummoxing because you've been educated as a science student to look at everything in isolation. You've been compartmentalized,
right,
to use a term, from intelligence, to only look at things in these isolated, buckets. Which is, for example, when a student is in school in the time of Bach, the first subject that they study every morning from first grade on, and our dear musician Bach was in this system in Germany, was logic.
Yes.
And the second subject was grammar, and the third subject was law, and then they broke for lunch. Oh, they started out with an hour of choir singing before they got to the logic.
Right.
So they had their brains cohered from an hour of singing scriptural music. And then they went in to study logic. But if you look at the way that math is taught now and the way that liberal education functions, the only people who get to study logic are people who do advanced mathematics in graduate school.
May I give you a correction?
Oh, sure.
I was placed into an accelerated mathematics course when I started junior high school. My father wouldn't let me be skipped grades, but he did allow me to take this accelerated math program. So when I had algebra in junior high school, we had for the first, I think, 6 to 8 weeks, Kelly, we spent it in symbolic logic, doing Boolean algebra, Venn diagrams, truth tables. It was a graduate course in logic.
Well, lucky you.
Yeah, I have to say that was one of the things in my life that really drove it home. And kudos to the South Dakota system at the time for having that kind of program.
Yeah, but that's still an advanced student on track for further advanced work.
Right.
Which is my idea is that you can't learn to falsify hypotheses without logic.
Right.
And
right.
And logic actually applies, as you know, to more than just mathematics.
Right.
It applies to thinking in general.
Yes.
So you don't have the tools to falsify narratives either.
Right. Well, the problem that I think many people have with the weapon hypothesis is, as you say, when they've been taught science or physics, they've been taught these little isolated compartments, and this hypothesis is a highly integrative synthetic effort.
Yeah.
You can't comprehend it with,
well, even myself, in our first conversation, I was trained I studied quantum mechanics,
right.
At a, increasingly high level, and I studied electrodynamics.
Right.
And so I'm thinking about the pyramid, and if you go back and listen to that recording, I'm constantly referring to various aspects of the electromagnetic spectrum. And it wasn't until I listened to that tape as I was preparing it for publication that I realized that I missed the main point, which was the fact that we're talking about harmonics in general. We're not talking about electrodynamics.
Right.
And so I started thinking about a model for that. And the model I came up with was that when you're dealing with the massive at the beginning, you're dealing with the vibration of masses. And the lower the frequency of that vibration, the bigger the mass.
Yep.
Like elephants stomping their feet and they can hear it 20 miles away.
Yeah.
Right. These are extremely low frequency vibrations. And then as you get to smaller masses, you get into the molecular vibration. Right. And that's going to be, that's going to have somewhat different mathematics associated with it. And then you get below that and you get to the atomic vibrations, which we're used to, that electromagnetism solidly applies to. And then you get below that into quarks, and you go back down below that. So each increasing step that you go is less massive.
Right.
So the lower the mass, the higher the frequency.
Yeah. Yeah. It's one hard. This is, I think, the thing that most people have difficulty with, particularly people that have had the compartmentalized physics approach. Is, they're taught to think of electromagnetics as one set of phenomena and acoustics as another.
Right.
But in fact, the harmonic series is one harmonic series.
Right. Right. This is the physics of harmony.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and it's a very different way of thinking, and you have to let go of all that compartmentalization and stop using the language. Stop reaching for the language you've been taught.
Right.
And start freshly going in and saying, let us focus on what the actual words are that Dr. Farrell is putting down,
right,
and use that as our starting point, and let all that other stuff that you've learned go. Maybe apply the processes. And
well, that's the difficulty in writing these books, is because I knew writing them that I was going to come up against the standard physics models. So how do I make it clear what I'm trying to say to someone with that background? And it's very, very difficult.
So if you want
the other part of the difficulty is I'm not a scientist.
Right.
I don't think that way.
Right.
So I have to be careful too about, is what I'm saying going to make sense to someone who does think that way?
Well, you were trained in theology. And theology goes back to to logos and the first principles, right?
Yes. Right.
And you proceed from first principles to build that theological structure, which is kind of like a word math.
Yes.
When you really start digging into theology, you find out like, whoa, this is really mathematical.
It's highly mathematical. Yes, it is. That's quite true.
Yeah. And so if you have that as a starting point, like you did, you're less likely to be diverted into this other way of thinking.
Yes, well, I had an email just today from somebody that sent me a YouTube video of someone on YouTube claiming that I've gone to a full-blown materialism because of my topological metaphor of the medium.
Oh, yeah, well, that's an interesting topic that I actually wanted to talk to you about today. Is, whatever the status of one's belief, right? When you're reading these, Sumerian and Akkadian texts and translations of texts, as well as the Giza series, you're and the Cosmic War, which is really part of the Giza series, and how do you deal with the compartmentalization of the scientific and the theological? The way that the books, the subjects, the topics, and even the translations are done seems to fall into some of that same compartmentalization.
Well, I know what you're talking about, and that's a very good point. My problem is that traditional theology, and for me, when I say traditional theology, I mean traditional Christian theology. It really isn't so neatly compartmentalized as people think. That compartmentalization is really more a legacy of the late Enlightenment than it is of anything in theology, be it Eastern theology or medieval scholasticism or what have you. Theologians have, by the nature of the case, they have to deal with science. They have to deal with the history of science. They have to deal with law. They have to deal with the development of law. It's one of those disciplines where you are constantly being affected by what's taking place in other disciplines. So you've got to train yourself to think synthetically rather than in a compartmentalized fashion. It's really the modern world that wants to, push theology into the closet and say, well, this is just your personal belief system, and we've got nothing to do with that. Well, that's baloney. The other problem is that when you turn to ancient systems of belief, particularly in Egypt, you're dealing with a culture which does not have these neat and tidy dividing lines between religion and then philosophy and then physics. And, to them, this is one interconnected continuum of things. And you find a similar attitude the further east you go. It's certainly part of Vedic culture. It's certainly, from what I've gathered from talking to you, it's certainly part of Buddhist culture. So these neat post-enlightenment Western compartmentalized dividing lines are just not part of the way I think. They never really have been.
Well, they cut, in modern education, quote unquote, modern education, they think that the world was created in 1600.
Yeah. Well, I don't think they go even back that far. I think they go back maybe as far as Kant. And
right.
That's it,
Yeah.
Yeah.
These guys are the ultimate, creationists.
Well, they really are. And you stop and think of people like Newton and Leibniz and their exposure to ancient culture and how much that exposure influenced their own, not only their own systems, but even their own mathematical developments.
Yeah. They stood on the shoulders of giants, and we stand on the shoulders of little people.
Yeah, we do. We really do. There was something bad that happened in the Enlightenment, and as a result we've been struggling with this compartmentalized mentality ever since. And that mentality, and again, you're totally right, you can't approach the weapon hypothesis of the Great Pyramid with that mentality. It just won't work. This is the structure itself, in all of those dimensional analogs, the structure itself suggests, in fact, in a certain sense compels, that it be approached synthetically.
Yeah, in a unitary format.
In a unitary format.
And if you need a model to think about it, let's take the topic of mathematics. Whether you're doing arithmetic, whether you're doing algebra, whether you're doing calculus, whether you're doing tensor analysis, quaternions, whatever the model is, you're still doing math.
Right.
And those individual tool sets are each useful for describing certain kinds of problems and right. processing them, right?
Right.
Well, you need to think about law in that light.
Right.
The legal principles, right?
Right.
Which is kind of its own kind of word math, right?
It is, yes.
It's a logical. It's a set of logical techniques that are based on words and concepts behind them.
It's a what I call it's an informally explicit system.
Right.
And
go ahead.
Yeah, well, and the same thing about theology. Theology is probably a little more formally explicit than law.
Right.
But the two did overlap for a considerable period, and you can't, my point about that is you can't understand modern law without understanding the Middle Ages, and you can't understand the Middle Ages without theology. There's just no way.
Right.
The American secular paradigm breaks down in education because you just can't understand certain things without religion, without law, without philosophy. And we're trying to have our cake and eat it too, and we're producing the mess we have now.
Yeah, well, I say I've had several friends of mine who describe themselves as atheists, and I always say to them, so, well, everyone has a theology, but only religious people will admit it.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. I've run into the occasional atheist that will admit that their position is really a kind of religion, but they're few and far between. But I think, again, that's just a product of this compartmentalization that we've produced. And the compartmentalization, it's inadequate to approach something like the Great Pyramid, because, like I say, the structure itself demands a synthetic approach. A purely analytical dissecting approach is not going to understand it. And once you get to the point of saying that a synthetic approach is needed, then part of that approach is, well, who built this dang thing? What sort of society would produce this? And then what sort of society would presume to use it in the sense that I'm suggesting.
Yeah, but they don't sound like nice people.
They're not. you know, they're not at all. And that's the other thing that we have to, that I think is part of the problem in the alternative research community. We see this from ufology to everything else, is this idea that advanced beings are going to be somehow morally superior.
Yeah.
I don't see that at all. In fact, there's no logical connection between the two. So why should they be morally superior just because they have all this technology?
Yeah, well, there seems to be a relationship between Vatican II and Golden Gate Park in 1968.
Yeah, they're really, yeah, they're, yes, there's a direct line from Vatican II to Haight-Ashbury. I I grant that proposition. That's absolutely true. Yeah.
Yeah, because I remember, I was raised a Catholic, and I remember being in church, and I was like, let's see, I was about, I think it was 71 or 72. We came to church on Sunday, and the altar had been moved around.
Yep.
And the chairs have been moved around, and there's a bunch of people with folk guitars standing on the altar.
Oh my, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and the priest was no longer wearing the traditional vestments, and neither were the altar servers. They were wearing like this weird burlap,
Yep.
and instead of giving out the little, the little wafers, the hosts that were like the little dry wafers, they were tearing bread, and it was like a total culture shock.
Well, it's important. Yeah, Vatican II people think of as a Roman Catholic event. No, Vatican II was the model for similar processes in all, and I do mean all, the Protestant churches.
Right, and we're seeing the results of that today.
We're seeing the results of it today. And again, it was this disconnected, disjointed mentality, and it's a mentality completely at variance with the ancient Egyptian mentality.
So that's all a part of the epistemological war we've been in.
Yes, I think so. Yes, absolutely.
I mean, I heard a story about a church in Portland that gathered the ire of the conservative Archbishop of Portland so intensely that they actually broke into the church and got all the vestments and burned them.
Oh my! Who broke into the church? The conservatives or the
conservatives? Under the direction of the Archbishop, broke into the church, took all the vestments, and burned them.
Well, that means that the Archbishop thought that there had been a sacrilege done.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'm not surprised. I'm not surprised. We've been brought up to think that these symbols bear no relationship to the message. So that if you wear a piece of burlap in church and it has some hideously, monstrously ugly applique sewn onto it that screams love, joy, peace, hallelujah at you, that's no different than the pre-Vatican II brocade vestments, and it's absolutely the other way around. And the biggest change for me in talking about this sort of subject is the change from what I would call proper liturgical English to Yoo-hoo, the Yoo-hoo liturgy. Oh, you who are holy, you're really you who are really a cool dude. I call it the Yoo-hoo liturgy. Yoo-hoo.
Yeah, like merrily I say to you.
Yeah, merrily I say to you. There is a certain kind of liturgical English that was always associated with church speak, just as there's a kind of music. And it's the degradation of symbol again that the modern world fosters and promotes because they don't want the beautiful, the good, and the true.
Yeah, I mean, you see it everywhere. It's in everything. We live in the age of ugly.
Well, imagine if you had unleashed modernists in ancient Egypt.
Oh, they would have been treated as heretics.
Well, imagine what the Temple of Luxor would look like,
Yeah,
designed by a modern architect.
it would look like it would look like a Motel 6.
It would look, yeah, well, if even that good.
Yeah, yeah, they wouldn't even leave the light on for you.
No, no light. What do you need that for? That's insulting the climate.
Yeah, yeah, you're hurting
Yeah.
the climate, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, that's amazing. I was at a coffee shop recently, and I was looking at, I always love looking at the state of our culture and the coffee shop art. A lot of coffee shops like to put up local artists,
Mhm.
but their curation skills are rather wanting.
Mhm.
And so I looked at these paintings, and they were there was like just little bits of blue, kind of like you would do with the spray, like spray paint, and little bits of pink, and all sort of amorphous. And I said to the owner, I said, "Congratulations." She said, "What?" And I said, "This is a milestone in modern art." And she said, "What do you mean?" I said, these paintings have absolutely no ideas in them at all."
Good for you.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's it exactly. That's it.
And I've been
Exactly.
interacting with, it's interesting that some of the better art galleries in my city, uh, that some of those people were not buying the whole pandemic narrative. It's very interesting that art curators in general, there's a lot of art curators in my town that didn't buy the narrative because they curate all the time.
Right.
And so they were able to discern that curating the pandemic, it didn't fly.
Right. Exactly.
Right. And so they were able to see it. And we've talked about this loss of objective beauty, the
Yeah.
abandonment of objective beauty, the abandonment of objective truth, right? The abandonment of objective tradition, all this abandonment of objectivity, and this fall into gross and malevolent subjectivity is the issue of our time.
It is because these people worship process. Uh, it's
Yeah, and the people who ran the concentration camps, they worship process too.
process too. Yeah, it's the abandonment of any, and like you say, any idea of objective beauty. Well, I defy people on my website many years ago in the forum area. I posted some quote music unquote by Arnold Schoenberg. And yeah, you know who he is and what sort of claptrap and tripe he quote composed
Yeah, I
unquote.
think you've referred to it as composition by committee.
Yeah, it is. It is. And it's such hideously ugly music that people don't listen to it. You don't go to a Schoenberg concert to enjoy. In fact, you don't go to a Schoenberg concert, period, much less go to one to enjoy the music.
No, you just want notice that it's over.
You just want notice that it's over, and then you can show up at the concert hall.
Yeah,
It's truly hideous music, but underneath the posting, it's kind of music without ideas, like you're painting without ideas.
right.
It's just all process. Underneath this, I posted a video of Nora the cat playing the piano
Oh,
so that people could compare Schoenberg's actual effort to, quote, compose music to that of a cat sitting at a piano picking out music. And what emerges from the video is rather interesting that people pointed this out. What emerged from the video of Nora the cat was that she was at least making the attempt to produce harmonic music. You could tell that she was, and she was frustrated because she didn't know how.
right.
But she was at least attempting to do it because she'd keep pecking with her paw at more or less the same cluster of notes.
Right. And her paws were not too short to reach the pedals,
And her paws were too short to reach the pedals, and so on.
which is sort of the epitaph of the modern age. It's people are too short to reach the pedals.
Yeah, well, yes. Yeah, they just can't produce beauty. It's endemic to the age, I'm afraid. But
Yeah, yeah, and these are art curators I know. have really absorbed the message of we need to bring back objective beauty.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
know,
Because the
really,
other stuff isn't selling.
right? Because people don't respond to it because, you know, the era of the sort of the era of the contrasting anti is just about over.
Well, I pointed out in my book, Microcosm and Medium, that this move toward modernism in the arts, particularly in music and the visual arts, was really a promotion of the American intelligence community. And it's run out of steam because really it was an artificial thing to begin with. You know, I wouldn't pay you 10 cents for a Jackson Pollock. You know, that kind of quote unquote art will never hang in my house ever.
Well,
Ever.
I was talking to a composer. It must have been about 15 years ago. You know, and he was finishing up his PhD in music out in California, no less. And and I said, well, what's your PhD? What are you doing for your PhD? He said, well, I'm writing a symphony, a chromatic symphony. And I
Oh,
said, why would you do that? And he says, well, that's what people do now.
yeah, exactly. That's what they do. Yeah.
Because all the other ideas are already gone. And I said, well, the older music used that stuff, but really what they were doing was they're doing musical narratives. They're telling stories. They're telling the human story. They're telling the creation story. The wedding story. They're telling
The problem, Kelly, in the arts is that America has bought the modernist idea that in order to be original, it must be absolutely unique.
right.
And therefore, all of that traditional stuff, all the Bach, Beethoven, Haydn, Mozart, all of that type of sounding music is no longer original,
I
which
mean,
is absolute BS
yeah,
because you cannot sit down and listen to the Beatles or to ABBA or to Duran Duran or the Backstreet Boys or whoever and not be listening to an original piece of music that makes sense because it's still within the bounds of musical tradition.
just as an exercise about 2 months ago when I was composing a piece of folk music, I decided to go online and see if I could find chord diagrams for Bach pieces.
Mm-hmm.
And I found some.
Sure.
And so I started writing folk songs with Bach chord progressions. And you know what? It's wound up sounding like the Beatles.
Sure.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
right.
Now, the Beatles, both John Lennon and Paul McCartney, actually, it's known that they actually studied certain pieces of Bach and learned to play them on guitar.
And Pete Townsend
Pete Townsend as well, yes.
he studied Purcell.
Yes, and Duke Ellington again. You know, these people are not working in a vacuum, folks. And there's a reason that their music still inspires is because their music was inspired by other inspiring music.
Right. And
So,
other
you know,
inspiring ideas.
and other inspiring ideas. You know, but these people that want to mimic Arnold Schoenberg because that's what we do now.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, they have no public, they have no audience, and they have no sympathy from me. None, zero, zilch, nada.
Yeah, he was not an impressive individual. Let's just leave it at that.
Yeah, I can. The moment you said he's writing a chromatic symphony, I thought, oh, there we go.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a terrible thing. Well, Joseph, so your book is out. I actually got
Yes.
a copy. You know, if you order it from Adventures Unlimited Press .com, you can get it in a couple of days. And if you wind up ordering it on Amazon, you're not going to get it until May or June.
Right. Right.
So you definitely want to go to Adventures Unlimited Press and order it there. And then the next book, the fifth book in the Pyramid trilogy, is going to be out in the summer. And any interesting things you're working on with the Giza community? Any webinars or any other interesting stuff?
No, I'm not working on anything like that. I'm toying with an idea, but I don't even want to mention it because I don't want to get people's hopes up in case I can't put together the money to do it. But anyway.
Yeah, and there's in a couple of your other books have been coming up recently. People are doing a lot of talk about on the right. They're doing a lot of talk about the sinister plots of the collective left, And
Uh-huh.
on the left, they're doing lots of work or discussion anyway.
About the sinister plots of the
Uh,
collective right.
and there are two interesting books that you wrote that I don't think get enough attention, and we should probably do some complete shows on them at some point. I think you covered them with Daniel List up at Dark Journalist, but they are the books about McCarthy.
Oh yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Right. And
Talk
so,
about the one individual that is so maligned. Uh yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
so I want to encourage people, if you're interested in the topic of McCarthy, the committee era of the 1950s, Roswell, the Deep State, Trotsky, Roosevelt, the Bolsheviks, Marshall, and that entire milieu of mid-century treachery. I definitely encourage you to go up to Lulu and take a look at Joseph's McCarthy books,
Yeah.
because they're very pertinent to what's happening now.
Oh, absolutely they are.
And
Absolutely they
they
are.
get more pertinent as the weeks roll on in the current dilapidated state of our 1970 AMC Gremlin United States.
Yeah. McCarthy, all people need to remember about McCarthy is that Bobby Kennedy thought enough of him to attend his funeral secretly,
Well,
which
Bobby
he did.
Kennedy was the lawyer on his committee.
He was a lawyer on McCarthy's committee. Yeah.
And not only that, but Kennedy was on one of his committees too, the John F.
Yeah. John F. Kennedy was on the Government Operations Committee, I think beginning in 54 for a very brief period.
Right.
Kennedy, Symington, I forget who, Henry Jackson, Scoop
Yeah.
Jackson were the Democrat minority people, I think, on McCarthy's committee. But McCarthy was very close friends with the Kennedy family.
Yeah.
And talk about a maligned figure, in my opinion, very unjustly maligned figure. And I'm not saying that the man wasn't a shameless political opportunist. He was a political opportunist like any other politician.
Right. But he was also a judge.
He was also a judge. He was not. He had committed nothing like the crimes we've seen the politicians committing today and getting away with.
Yeah, I remember that
Nothing
anecdote about he there was a journalist, Drew Preston, Drew Pearson.
Drew Pearson. Yeah.
Yeah. So you want to tell it, or you want me to tell it?
Well, Drew Pearson was well known. He was an obnoxious left-wing commentator back in his day. And I'm trying real hard to think of an obnoxious commentator that he would compare to so that people can get an opinion.
Well, today there's just too many of them.
Yeah, that's the problem. Think of Drew Pearson as kind of all of the people on CNN and MSNBC rolled into one person.
Or your Twitter feed over the course of 20 minutes.
Yeah, exactly. This is Drew Pearson. He was hated even by the left because nobody was sacred to him. And McCarthy was invited to a party. And of course, Pearson hated McCarthy. So McCarthy was invited to one of these DC soirees where the hostess thought that she was going to be really clever and sit Pearson and McCarthy next to each other at the dinner table. And of course, the fireworks erupted almost immediately and everybody had dinner. So on the way out after the dinner, McCarthy went into the coat room to get his coat. He got his coat, and in walks Drew Pearson. And shortly behind Pearson is Richard Nixon. and McCarthy's getting his coat, and Pearson said something snotty to him, and McCarthy belted him.
Wow.
Just hauled off and socked him. Knocked him to the ground. And of course, Richard Nixon is standing there with his jaw down on the floor. And McCarthy turns to Nixon and says, "That one was for you, Dick." And Pearson ended up suing McCarthy, of course. He won. But the next day when McCarthy was walking onto the Senate floor, he passed a couple of he passed a couple of senators. One was a famous Democratic senator, and the senator gave him a smile and a wink and said, "I heard you had some fisticuffs yesterday," and they talked a little bit, and the senator leaned over and whispered, "Good going. We've been waiting to do that for quite a while."
Wow.
Something like that. So yeah, and the other part of the story was it was after that incident that McCarthy got a wristwatch in the mail that was sent to him from someplace in Missouri, but there was no indication who the wristwatch was from.
Here's your parting gift.
Yeah, and McCarthy always thought that was a watch from Harry Truman.
Oh my God, Jay, tell him what he's won.
Yeah, exactly.
Wow. Yeah, that whole committee era in the 50s, we got to do a show on that because there was all kinds of committees going on.
Oh, absolutely. The McCarran Committee, the Reese Committee, McCarthy.
1942 to 1963.
Yeah. Yeah. House Un-American Activities Committee. Yeah. All of that stuff is so hugely important because, in my opinion, you're dealing with politicians that know that there's a rot in Washington, and this is I think it was really the last period that we had to fix this system, which was absolutely just gutted by Franklin Roosevelt.
Right, and then of course they put the 2-term limit in, which prevented a long-term, let's say, more American idealist to be in the White House for 20 years to fix it.
Well, that, and then you had the passage of that Bureaucracy Act that you can't fire any permanent bureaucracy, which I think is ridiculous. The president should be able to fire the whole lot of them.
Yeah, in fact, one of the things that Trump didn't do until like late in his last year, it was 6 months before he left office, they published like something called Schedule F, which said if you're making policy that affects the American people, then you need to be in this new classification bucket, and the White House can terminate that anybody in that Schedule F, and that's one of the reasons why the bureaucracy went ape over trying to get rid of Trump.
Oh, I can believe it.
Yeah,
because it used to be the case that to the victor went the spoils.
Right. And I think the power structure, the Intel Fourth Branch and the Congress have been trying to convert us into a broken parliamentary system, and trying to really weaken the power of the executives.
Yeah, very broken, very broken.
Yeah, and so we've been seeing a lot of the attacks on Trump, a lot of the attacks on governor, doing enforcing laws in their borders. There's all these attacks on what I would call the rational executive.
Right.
But anyway, Joseph, we're an hour and 56 minutes in. I really appreciate talking to you. And is there anything else you'd like to add before we wind up?
Nope, that'll do it. We'll see you the next time.
All right, see you the next time. Thank you for joining us on The Common Surface.
Thank you for having me.
We'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.